I'm Sarah Whitfield, 34 years old, and the night of my father's 71st birthday will always be burned into my memory. The garden lights shimmered across rows of tables, laughter spilling through the air like champagne. I walked in quietly, wearing a navy suit that fit like armor, and carried a single envelope pressed flat in my hand. Dozens of guests turned to watch, as my father, standing tall with a wine glass, declared that I wasn't his real daughter, and therefore had no place in his will. The crowd laughed with him, but I didn't. I just kept moving forward, calm and deliberate, holding the gift that would change everything. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who never believed in you. I wasn't always seen as an outsider. My childhood carried soft memories of bedtime stories, pink bicycles with ribbons on the handlebars, and Sunday mornings filled with the smell of cinnamon pancakes. My mother, Margaret, used to brush back my hair and tell me that even though I hadn't been born from her body, I had grown in her heart. As a little girl, I believed those words were a secret crown I wore proudly. My father, Charles Stern, but respected in our Sacramento community, seemed proud when I brought home good grades. For a time, it felt like I belonged. That sense of belonging began to crumble the year my brother Daniel was born. I was 8 then, clutching a stuffed animal in the hospital waiting room, eager to meet him. At first, I thought it was natural for the baby to take all the attention, but as weeks passed, the gap between us widened. I would run from school with a painting in hand, hoping my mother would notice, only to see her eyes locked on Daniel in his car seat. My father's words one evening cut deeper than any silence. After I spilled juice at the dinner table, he muttered that I wasn't even blood. He thought I didn't hear, but I did, and it stayed with me. From that moment, the warmth in our home seemed to cool. My accomplishments were tucked into drawers, while Daniel's finger paintings went up on the walls. The bedtime stories stopped, and instead of being the daughter who needed care, I became the helper who filled in the gaps. I cleaned, I babysat, I worked hard to please, but each effort felt like chasing affection that kept slipping further away. The girl who once thought she was chosen slowly learned she was optional. By the time I reached my teenage years, that truth settled heavily inside me. I didn't rebel or lash out. Instead, I planned. Every night, I sketched designs of houses I dreamed of, building promises on paper that someday I'd create a life that couldn't be taken from me. What my father didn't give me, I would build with my own hands. And yet that night in the garden, years later, as I stood before his table with the envelope, he never expected, I realized the silence of my childhood had led me here. Part 2 would reveal how the first real injustice cut so deep it changed the way I saw my place in that family forever. The shift in my family began slowly, almost invisibly, when I was 8 years old. I remember sitting in a hospital waiting room holding a stuffed rabbit the nurses had given me as a big sister gift. The air smelled like antiseptic and coffee, and I kept my legs swinging nervously off the plastic chair as my mother's delivery stretched into the night. When the nurse finally walked out with a smile and announced that my brother had been born, everyone's attention surged past me. Margaret was glowing, cradling baby Daniel in her arms, while Charles clapped his friends on the back with a proud grin. In that moment, the center of gravity shifted, and I began to feel myself pushed to the edges of the family picture. At first, I tried not to notice. A newborn demands care, and I told myself that things would return to normal once the excitement wore off. But the small signs never stopped. At school pickup, I would run toward the car, holding up a painting I had worked on all day, only to watch my mother's eyes flick quickly over it before returning to Daniel strapped into his car seat. He was the one who made her smile, while my picture slipped onto the floorboard, forgotten. I told myself it didn't matter, but deep down I kept wondering why her attention felt like a door that had suddenly closed. The words that truly marked the change came one evening at the dinner table. I was pouring a glass of juice, and my hand trembled enough that it spilled across the tablecloth. Charles snatched a towel and muttered under his breath, "She's not even blood." He thought I hadn't heard, but I had. The sentence lodged inside me like a stone. After that, the warmth that once lived in that house seemed to drain away. My awards from school were tucked into drawers, while Daniel's messy finger paintings earned frames and a place on the wall. I became the helper instead of the child. I changed diapers, fetched bottles, and rocked Daniel in the living room while my parents entertained friends. The bedtime stories I had loved disappeared without explanation. I still tried to earn their approval. I stayed up late making birthday cards with glitter glue, cooked simple meals when Margaret was tired, and polished the kitchen floor until it shone. But no matter what I did, it felt like my efforts vanished into thin air, unnoticed. Slowly, I learned that attention was not something I could claim. It was something that belonged to my brother. As the years passed, the distance only grew. Family outings were filled with Daniel's milestones and chatter about his future. I sat at the edge of conversations, smiling politely as if I were just another guest at the table. Even at school, the difference showed. When Margaret came for parent-teacher conferences, she asked about Daniel's progress before I had even finished my report card explanation. My teachers looked at me with pity. But pity wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to feel seen. By the time I turned 12, I began to understand that being adopted hadn't made me special. It had made me conditional. I could sense it in the way Charles avoided eye contact when I tried to share good news, or the way Margaret brushed me aside with a tired wave whenever Daniel needed something. I realized I was chasing love that kept retreating just out of reach. Eventually, I stopped running after it. My teenage years carried a quiet loneliness. On the surface, I was the dependable daughter who helped with chores and never caused trouble. But behind closed doors, I poured my energy into planning for a future that belonged solely to me. I filled notebooks with sketches of houses, each line representing a promise to myself that I would build something no one could take away. I didn't dream of wealth or recognition. I dreamed of permanence of walls that could not be stripped away like the affection I once knew. When I was 15, the reality finally settled deep inside me. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was something colder, quieter. I was optional. That knowledge changed the way I walked through the halls of my own home, careful not to disturb, careful not to expect. But it also fueled a determination I carried like a hidden flame. Every time I heard Daniel praised, every time I felt invisible, I reminded myself that someday I would create a life that proved I belonged. On my 18th birthday, that resolve carried me out the door for good. There was no celebration, no warm words, no farewell hugs. Breakfast was cold toast on chipped plates, while Charles rustled his newspaper without looking up. Margaret wished me good luck as though I were a neighbor moving away, and Daniel, then 9 years old, barely noticed I was leaving as he played video games in the living room. I packed my belongings into 2 worn duffel bags, one stuffed with clothes and textbooks, the other holding a sketch pad filled with designs for a dream home that had kept me steady through sleepless nights. I stood at the threshold of that house, waiting for someone to say more, but no one did. So I walked out into the morning air, not angry, not sad, simply free. I carried $412 in my wallet, a scholarship acceptance letter in my backpack, and a determination that no silence could break. The bus to San Diego rumbled away from the station, and for the first time, I felt that I wasn't running from anything. I was moving towards something that was mine alone. What I didn't yet know was how hard that first year would be. I didn't yet see the thin mattress on a cold garage floor or the late-night shifts that would leave me exhausted but unbroken. All I knew then was that my life with the Whitfields had ended in silence, and my own life was beginning in its place. That was enough to carry me forward. And as the bus carried me south, I thought about the drawings folded in my bag, the houses, the lines, the dreams, and I promised myself that I would never be erased again. When I arrived in San Diego, everything I owned fit into 2 duffel bags. One held my clothes, the other my sketchbooks, a few textbooks, and the floor plan of a house I had drawn when I was 13. The paper was creased from years of folding, but I carried it like a compass pointing toward a future I hadn't yet reached. My scholarship covered tuition, but rent, food, and every other expense would have to come from me. I found a garage apartment not far from campus, a narrow space with cracked concrete floors and a single small window covered in duct tape where the glass had split. The mattress I bought secondhand was thin, and in the winter the cold seeped through the walls like water. I worked nights at the front desk of a 24-hour gym, answering phones and wiping down treadmills when the crowd thinned out. On weekends, I tutored high school students in math, trying to squeeze every dollar I could from the few hours left in my schedule. Dinner was often instant noodles or a pastry someone left behind at the coffee shop across the street. Still, I kept my grades high. Architecture wasn't just a subject to me, it was a lifeline. Each line I drew on a blueprint was a reminder that I was building something no one could erase. There were nights I wanted to quit. I would sit at the small desk crammed against the wall of that garage, my breath turning to fog in the air, staring at equations I couldn't make sense of. But then I would think of Charles's words that I wasn't blood, and my focus would sharpen. That sentence became fuel. I poured everything into my studies, memorizing structural systems, practicing computer design programs until dawn, and sketching drafts that I refined again and again. I wasn't just trying to pass classes, I was trying to create permanence. By my junior year, people began to notice. One of my professors stopped me after class and asked if I had considered applying for an internship. A week later, he introduced me to an eco-design firm looking for help. They specialized in sustainable construction, and the opportunity meant more hours, more responsibility, and more pressure. But I didn't hesitate. I signed on knowing it would leave me even more exhausted. That year, I often walked home long after midnight, my shoes worn thin, but I didn't mind. I was no longer invisible. My name was on project files my work recognized in meetings. I didn't call home during those years. I didn't send updates. No one asked how I was doing, and I realized that silence could sometimes be a gift. When graduation came, I crossed the stage without looking for anyone in the audience. My diploma was handed to me, and the space where my family might have sat remained empty. I didn't invite them, and I didn't regret it. Walking off that stage, I carried only pride and relief, not longing. After graduation, San Diego felt like more than an escape. It felt like home. The salty air from the coast, the angular buildings downtown, the sunsets that painted the horizon red and orange, they all became part of me. I accepted a position at a green construction company, starting as a junior design engineer. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave me purpose. I volunteered for every project no one else wanted. Old school renovations, apartment retrofits, and low-budget housing repairs. I showed up early, stayed late, and left my mark wherever I could. Within a year, I was leading my first independent project. It was a small solar-powered duplex in Chula Vista, built for families who couldn't afford much. The site wasn't pretty, and the budget was thin, but when the final walls went up, I stood there knowing my fingerprints were in every corner. Seeing that building completed was proof that I mattered, even if my family never said so. I wanted more. At night in my modest apartment, I filled pages with new designs. I imagined homes that didn't just stand against the elements, but worked with them, places that felt like shelters for both body and spirit. Eventually, those sketches pushed me to create something of my own. With only a few $100s and a website I coded myself, I registered a company name, Viridian Design. The first months were silent. Emails went unanswered, calls unreturned. I lived off my savings, eating canned soup and rationing utilities while I waited for one person to believe in me. That person arrived in the form of a woman named Linda Vargas, a single mother who had inherited a small, crumbling lot. Every builder she had spoken to quoted prices she couldn't pay. I listened to her story and offered a design using reclaimed materials, passive cooling systems, and affordable solar. She hesitated, then signed the papers with a smile. 6 months later, Linda and her son moved into a home filled with sunlight and warmth. It was modest, but it stood strong, and it reflected who she was: resilient and steady. A local newspaper wrote an article calling it a sustainable sanctuary, and after that, my phone began to ring. In 3 years, Viridian Design grew into a team of 6. We opened a small office near Balboa Park, and contracts came in from nonprofits, developers, and even the city council. Every time I walked into that office, I remembered the silence of my childhood and the voice in my head that had once told me I was optional. Now I knew that I had built a place where I wasn't just included, I belonged. Yet even as success surrounded me, the memory of my family lingered. I hadn't spoken to Charles or Margaret in more than a decade, but sometimes late at night I would imagine what might happen if I knocked on their front door. Would they recognize me? Would they see who I had become? Those thoughts passed quickly, but they never fully left. It was during one of those quiet nights while I was revising blueprints at my kitchen table that a message came through from an old classmate. It was short. "Your dad's on the news. Big retirement. Huge birthday party coming up. Thought you'd want to know." I deleted the text, but the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind. I tried to bury myself in work, but the thought returned again and again. I wondered if showing up could prove something, not to gain acceptance, but to release the weight I had carried since childhood. That thought became the seed of an idea I couldn't let go. The message about my father's retirement party lingered long after I deleted it. I tried to lose myself in design drafts, meetings, and site visits, but late at night, the thought returned like a whisper. For years, I had lived without their approval, building a life from nothing, but the idea of walking into that celebration carried a pull I couldn't dismiss. Not because I wanted their acceptance, but because I wanted to stand on my own terms. I remembered something Charles once said when I was 10 years old. We were in the yard, and I had just come home from another day of being picked last in school games. Sitting on the porch, I muttered that I didn't need friends. He glanced at me holding the garden hose and told me that what really mattered in life was owning land. It was what made people respect you, he said. I had never forgotten that. That memory shaped the idea that began forming in my mind. I didn't want to confront him with words. I didn't want a scene filled with shouting or tears. What I wanted was a gesture, something he couldn't ignore, something that reflected everything I had built without him. Land, the very thing he once told me, gave a person value. I searched until I found it. A parcel tucked against the slopes near Lake Tahoe, surrounded by redwoods, with the mountains rising in the distance. It wasn't just beautiful, it was untouched and alive with possibility. It cost more than $3 million, and I signed the papers without hesitation. To me, it wasn't a purchase. It was a statement. I had given myself what he claimed to find worth, and now I would hand it to him as a gift he could never repay. With the help of my attorney, I transferred the property into his name, The deed was drawn up neatly embossed with gold lettering and sealed in a leather folder. I didn't tell anyone about my plan, not my team, not friends, not even Linda, who often checked in on me as a friend long after we built her home. This was something I needed to do alone. The day of the party, I ironed my Navy suit, the same one I had worn when signing my first contract with the city council. I placed the deed carefully inside the folder, tracing the letters of my father's name on the cover. The drive north took more than 8 hours. I didn't play music. The silence filled the car, steady and unbroken, as if the road itself was preparing me. I thought of what I might say when I saw him, a simple greeting, a wish for a happy birthday, and the gift, nothing more. When I arrived at their home, the white fence still stood where it always had, and Margaret's daisies bloomed thick along the yard. The house looked almost untouched by time, though string lights and the sound of music marked the celebration. Guests in suits and dresses filled the lawn, holding glasses of champagne, their laughter rising above the hum of a jazz trio. I paused at the gate, steadying my breath. Then I walked in. For a moment, no one noticed me. People were too wrapped up in their conversations and the glow of the evening. Then I saw Daniel, taller now, his hair styled neatly, a drink in hand. He looked at me with surprise before his lips curved into a smirk. "Well, well," he said loud enough for others to hear. "If it isn't the charity case. Did you get lost?" His words drew a ripple of uneasy laughter from those around him. I held my smile and answered, "I came to drop off a gift." He raised an eyebrow, mocking. "Let me guess, something handmade. Maybe one of those craft projects you used to waste time on." More chuckles followed. I didn't respond. I walked past him, my focus fixed on the head table where Charles stood holding a glass of wine, Margaret at his side in a pale green dress. He noticed me mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed for just a moment before he composed himself with a smile that carried charm but no warmth. He tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we close, I want to share something important." The crowd quieted. He looked directly at me as he spoke. "To my son Daniel, I leave everything, the house, the accounts, the land. As for Sarah," he paused, letting the silence stretch. "She's not my biological child, so I didn't include her in the will." The laughter erupted immediately. Glasses clinked. People smiled awkwardly, and Margaret gave a soft laugh while keeping her gaze away from mine. I stood in the middle of the yard, the folder in my hand, the noise pressing in on me. For them, it was a moment of humor. For me, it was a final confirmation of what I had known all my life. I walked forward slowly, placing the folder on the head table beside the cake. Daniel tilted his head, amused. "So you did bring something," he muttered. I opened the folder and lifted the deed. The gold lettering caught the glow of the string lights. "I bought this for you," I said clearly. "A parcel at Lake Tahoe worth over $3 million. It could have been yours." Charles's expression tightened. I let the silence hold for a moment, then tore the paper in half. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I tore it again, then again, until the pieces drifted across the tablecloth like dry snowflakes landing among the candles and cake. The yard fell silent. For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. Margaret's hand trembled as she lifted her glass. Charles stood frozen. His lips parted slightly, his eyes locked on the shredded paper. I met his gaze and spoke evenly. "I didn't come here to beg. I came to show you what I've built without you." I turned and walked away, my heartbeat steady in my chest. Behind me, the music faltered, conversation stilled, and the party held its breath. By the time I reached the gate, a voice whispered among the guests, "Did she say 3 million?" Another murmured, "Why would they do that to her?" I didn't stop. I stepped onto the quiet street, leaving the lights and noise behind me. That night, driving back toward San Diego, I knew the silence wasn't over. It was only beginning, and soon I would hear what remained after the laughter faded. The drive back to San Diego was silent, the sound of the tires against the highway filling the car like a steady drumbeat. I replayed the evening in my mind, the way the laughter had spread through the yard, the look on Charles's face when the deed split into pieces. I had walked away, certain I didn't need to hear another word from him, certain the night had ended as cleanly as the rip of that paper. But endings rarely stay neat. 3 days later, an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone. I let it go to voicemail. A second call followed, then a text. "You don't know me, but my name is Erica. I was at your father's party. You need to hear what happened after you left." I hesitated before dialing back. When she answered, her voice carried both nerves and urgency. Erica Monroe introduced herself as a junior partner at my father's bank. She explained that she had only met me once as a child years ago, but she had recognized me the moment I stepped into the garden. When you walked out, she said the yard stayed frozen. No one spoke for several minutes. It was like you had pulled the ground out from under them. I sat in silence, listening as she continued. "Then your father bent down," she said softly. He got on his knees in front of everyone and began picking up the pieces of the deed one by one. He looked like he thought he could put it back together. Her words left me gripping the edge of the counter. She described how an old colleague of his, Mr. Kenley, finally stepped forward and said, "You're a fool, Charles. That woman you humiliated built something you couldn't even dream of." I closed my eyes as Erica's voice steadied. "He told your father you were worth more than everything in his will. After that, people began leaving. Some of them were shaking their heads. Others went to your mother, but she just kept saying, 'We didn't know.' Your brother tried to laugh it off, calling you dramatic, even suggesting you faked the deed. But no one laughed with him." That night, long after I ended the call, I sat at my desk with the city lights glowing faintly through the window. For the first time, I wondered if Charles had finally seen me, not the unwanted child, but the woman who had built her own name. I didn't want to believe I cared, yet the question stayed. 2 days later, a message came from my Aunt Carol Charles's sister. We hadn't spoken since I was a teenager. Her text was brief. "He's been in his study for hours. The torn deed is still on his desk. He won't speak to anyone." I stared at her words, then set the phone down. Sleep didn't come that night. A week passed before a letter arrived, handwritten on thick paper. No return address. Inside, the words began with my name plain and unadorned. "Sarah, I don't know how to begin. I failed you. I failed to keep the bond we had when you were little, and I failed to see what you became. At that party, I failed in front of everyone. I picked up the pieces of what you gave me, not just the paper, but the truth. I don't know how to make it right. I am sorry." He had signed it simply Charles. No Dad, just Charles. I held the letter for a long time. It didn't make me cry. It didn't undo the years of silence. Instead, I slid it into the old manila folder where I kept the earliest sketches of my dream house, as if it belonged with the versions of me that had once waited for his approval. I wasn't waiting anymore. The following morning, I called my project manager, David Sloan, and asked him to draw up plans for something new. A community center powered entirely by solar energy with open workspaces, gardens, and mentoring rooms. "Where do you want it?" he asked. I thought for a long moment before answering. "Lake Tahoe," I said. He paused. "Isn't that where the land was?" I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see me. "No, that's where my land is now." The decision gave me clarity. Instead of dwelling on the letter, I poured my energy into the design. I pictured glass walls that opened to the mountain air classrooms where teenagers could learn skills and gardens where families could gather. I wanted the place to be more than a building. I wanted it to be a haven for those who had nowhere else to go. At night, as I sketched and calculated, I sometimes wondered if Charles knew what I was doing, if he imagined me building on the very slopes where he had once been offered a chance to claim something lasting. I didn't send him updates, and I didn't respond to his letter. I let the silence remain stronger now on my terms, but as the foundation plans came together, I began to feel a shift deep inside me. For the first time, my story wasn't just about what had been taken from me. It was about what I was finally choosing to give. The plans for the community center took shape faster than I expected. David and I worked long hours in the office, spreading drafts across the table, adjusting layouts until every detail matched the vision in my head. Wide glass walls faced the mountains, classrooms opened toward the gardens, and solar roofs tied the design together. It wasn't just a building. It was a place meant to hold people the way a family was supposed to. Once the blueprints were approved, I returned to Lake Tahoe for the first time since buying the property. The land stretched across a slope that smelled of pine and earth. The air was sharp with the chill of higher altitudes, and the stillness made it feel as though the ground was waiting for something new. Standing there, I imagined the future walls rising, the rooms filled with voices. It steadied me. Construction began that fall. Trucks rolled in carrying beams and solar panels workers hammering through the early hours. I drove up every weekend to walk the site, speaking with the foreman, adjusting small details when needed. Each time I stood on the half-built foundation, I thought of Charles. I wondered if he knew this was happening, if word of the project had reached him. Part of me pictured him driving by, seeing the frames of a place that might have been his. But if he did, he stayed silent. As the months passed, the center rose from the dirt. First the steel skeleton, then walls of glass reflecting the sky, then gardens planted in fresh soil. When the final solar panels went up, I stood at the edge of the property, watching sunlight spill across the roof, and I felt something shift inside me. I had taken the scraps of what my family left me and built something stronger. The opening day came in spring. We named it The Haven. The doors swung wide for the first time, and people filled the space, a mix of teenagers from foster programs, single parents, and mentors ready to teach. The sound of laughter carried across the hallways, a sound that belonged here more than any chandelier or banquet table ever could. I moved through the rooms, speaking with volunteers, watching children paint murals on the walls, and listening to the hum of conversation in spaces that had once been empty. One afternoon, weeks after the opening, I was walking through the garden when a girl stopped me. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her dark hair fell into her face as she looked up at me, her voice steady but soft. "You really built this?" she asked. I nodded. "Even without a family?" The question caught me off guard. I paused, then answered simply, "Especially without a family." She studied me for a moment, then wrapped her arms around me in a quick, wordless hug before turning away. That moment stayed with me. It wasn't the speeches or the newspaper articles that gave me a sense of arrival. It was that single question asked by someone who needed the answer as much as I once had. I never replied to Charles's letter, and I never visited his house again. But sometimes, as the wind swept through the tall grass outside the haven, I pictured him standing at a distance, watching the place I built. I wondered if he thought of what he had lost when I tore that deed into pieces. I didn't need his recognition anymore, but I knew the image of those scraps haunted him. In the quiet of those evenings after the last visitor left and the halls emptied, I locked the doors and stepped outside beneath the stars. The air was cold, but the windows behind me glowed warm with the promise of what was inside. For the first time, I didn't feel like the child waiting on a porch for someone to notice. I felt like the one who had created a place where no one had to be invisible again. And even as I closed the gate each night, I sensed the story wasn't finished. Something was still coming, carried in the silence that stretched between my father and me, waiting for the day it would finally break. The haven was open for only a few months when the letters began arriving. They were addressed in Charles's neat handwriting, each envelope thick with the weight of words I never answered. I kept them in a desk drawer at first, but as they piled up, I placed them in the same folder where I stored my earliest sketches. It felt right keeping them alongside the versions of myself that had once waited for his approval. The community center was thriving. Every week, the halls filled with laughter and conversations. Teenagers who had aged out of foster care worked on murals in the classrooms. Mothers planted vegetables in the garden beds, their children running between the rows. Local volunteers held workshops on everything from carpentry to budgeting, and at night, the solar panels lit the space with a quiet glow. Each corner of the haven carried a piece of what I had once longed for, a sense of belonging. Still whispers of what happened after the party reached me from time to time. Erica called occasionally, sharing what she heard at the bank. Charles's colleagues no longer saw him as untouchable. Old friends spoke of him with pity. Some withdrew from him altogether. Daniel, she told me, grew more defensive, insisting I had staged the entire scene, but no one seemed to believe him. Margaret avoided the subject entirely, moving through social gatherings as if nothing had happened. Then came the call from Aunt Carol. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "He hasn't been the same since that night," she said. "He spends hours in his study. The pieces of that deed are still on his desk." She paused before adding, "He talks less. Sarah, sometimes not at all." I listened without answering, staring at the blueprint spread out before me. For years I had dreamed of hearing regret in his voice, of seeing him falter under the weight of his choices. Now that it was happening, it didn't bring the relief I thought it might. Instead, it felt distant, like an echo reaching me from a place I no longer lived. The haven kept me grounded. One afternoon, I was teaching a small group of students how to read floor plans when a boy pointed at a line on the paper and asked, "Why do you draw walls so thick?" I explained that strength mattered, that walls needed to hold and protect. He nodded thoughtfully, then said, "Like people." The room grew quiet for a moment, and I felt the truth of his words settle around us. More letters came. Some were long, others just a few lines. All of them circled the same message: apologies, confessions, a desire to see me. I never wrote back. I folded each one carefully and tucked it away. Not out of anger, but because silence felt like the only answer left. The center continued to grow. Donations began arriving after local papers wrote about our mission. We expanded the garden, added new classrooms, and built a workshop where volunteers could teach trade skills. Every addition reminded me that legacy wasn't built on names in a will. It was built in the lives we touched. Still at night, when the halls emptied and the doors were locked, I sometimes wondered what Charles thought as he sat in that study surrounded by scraps of torn paper. Did he imagine the home that land could have become? Did he picture me standing there stronger than he ever expected? Those questions lingered, but they no longer weighed me down. One evening as I closed up the haven, a group of teenagers lingered in the garden, laughing under the glow of the lights. Their voices rose against the backdrop of the mountains, and I stood still listening. For the first time, I understood that justice hadn't been delivered in a courtroom or a confrontation. It had unfolded here in this place where the children of strangers found what I never had. And while I turned the key in the lock that night, I sensed there was still one more chapter left in this story, one final moment of reckoning that would decide how the silence between my father and me would end. The seasons turned, and the haven grew into more than I could have imagined. Every week, I walked through its halls, listening to voices fill the rooms that had once been lines on a page. Children laughed as they painted murals across the walls. Teenagers worked beside mentors in the garden, and mothers gathered in the open-air classrooms to share stories over coffee. What I had once longed to find within my own family, I now watched bloom among strangers who had become something more. One afternoon, while I was checking on a new workshop, a girl named Ava stopped me. She was 16, sharp-eyed but cautious, and she studied me for a long moment before asking, "How did you build all this without anyone helping you?" I smiled and told her, "Especially without anyone helping me." Her shoulders relaxed, and in the quiet that followed, she gave me a quick hug before walking back to her group. That small gesture stayed with me longer than any recognition my father might have offered. The letters from Charles stopped coming eventually. I kept the ones he sent tucked away in the same folder where I stored my early sketches, but I never wrote back. I didn't need to. I knew his regret lived in the silence he had once used against me. Margaret and Daniel never reached out either, and I stopped wondering if they ever would. The family I had built here in these walls and gardens was the one that mattered now. When I stood outside at dusk, watching the solar panels glow under the fading light, I often thought about the long road that had carried me here. The child who once waited on a porch for her father's approval was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned that justice sometimes isn't about revenge or recognition. It's about creating something that lasts, something that gives others what you were denied. That is the legacy I chose. Not bitterness, not wealth, but belonging. And in the end, I realized I didn't need Charles to call me his daughter, or Margaret to see me or Daniel to envy me. I only needed to know that I had turned silence into shelter, and that the lives shaped within the haven would outlive every word they once withheld. Before I close my story, I want to leave you with this. Family may fail you sometimes in ways you never forget, but you still have the power to build your own belonging, to turn pain into something that gives others strength. That is where true justice lives. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear your thoughts, share them in the comments, and if it spoke to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves and never forget your worth.